Hey everybody, it's Anna and welcome back to my BookTube channel. This video is going to be about something a little bit different that I'm doing to try and expand my reading horizons, and that is that I joined a romance book club that takes place at one of my local bookstores. Now, I'm not like the most avid of romance readers. I have read a couple of romance novels here and there, but I realized that it's an entire genre that I haven't really explored very much at all, especially when it comes to books that are written just, as straight up romance novels for adults. I think that, like a lot of other people that read YA or read fantasy and stuff like that, there are some books that you read where romance is a feature of the book, but it isn't necessarily classified as that genre, if that makes sense. This is what I'm talking about, is reading books that would be shelved in a romance section kind of thing. So I realized that I have kind of this black hole in my reading life, and that there's this whole genre that I don't really experience very much, and I've been wanting to get more into it and kind of feeling a little bit overwhelmed and not knowing where to begin, because, and this is the part where we get to the, fun literary confessionals, I did not always think of romance as being like a legitimate genre of writing. I think that this definitely goes back to some weird internalized sexism and also being a closeted little queer baby when I was a teenager, where I was like, well, I don't want to read these books because they don't take women seriously, they're not feminist. I'm sure that it also had to do with the fact that I felt really uncomfortable with some of the more strange stock tropes of the genre. I was reading some gothic romance at the time, and I was like, I don't really like the fact that the female protagonist is very one-dimensional and she's falling for this hyper-aggressive man who also is her boss in an old English manner. I appreciated the atmosphere of it, but I think that the characterization, at least of the characters I was reading, really kind of turned me off to romance a bit. There are a couple exceptions to this. I did start reading Jane Austen's books around that time. I really love her works. As you know, I talk about them on the channel pretty frequently. And then I also discovered, thanks to this lady in a choir that I was singing in at the time, I discovered the books of Georgette Heyer, whom I also really enjoyed. But I never got super into reading all of her books. I know that a lot of people who read Georgette Heyer have read all of Georgette Heyer, and I never did. I read a few of her books, enjoyed them, and didn't really think anything of it. But I definitely had this weird hang up growing up and even into the beginning of college that those weren't real books, or I didn't need to be wasting my time or something like that. And I think that part of the reason why I'm intentionally setting out now to read more romance is to kind of unlearn and unpack some of the things that I've learned that I have as negative stereotypes or preconceptions about romance as a genre and romance readers. Because what I have come to realize over time is that romance readers are some of the best book lovers that you will ever meet. Mostly I know this from the internet and from the days when I used to work in a library, and the romance readers would come in with their giant boxes full of paperbacks that they had checked out once a week to return the box and then check out yet another box of books. And I was always really impressed at how much and how widely they read. But again, as kind of a teenager that was into, weird science fiction-y type stuff, I never thought that we would really have that much in common besides the fact that we just really liked books. I think things started to change when I began reading a lot more about how revolutionary it is to read books where women's pleasure is centered and a more feminine perspective is centered. And that's not to say that that's how all romance stories work, but the majority of romance stories that I have read so far have had female protagonists and cis female protagonists. So that is definitely something that is prevalent throughout the genre in a way that is not necessarily the same for other genres. And I started reading a lot more primary sources about women's pleasure and women being in charge of their own lives, and how it's really important to reclaim these type of stories and let them take their place in literature. So I began to think a little bit like more critically about what I had been taught or what I had internalized about what it means to read books with romantic plots. And the other thing that happened between then and now is that a couple of summers ago, I discovered queer romance, which was something that I had not read previously before. Anything that I had read that was queer romance was like gay men's erotica or fan fiction or, you know, just kind of little scraps here and there where I could find it. It wasn't something that I was aware of us having at my library growing up or being accessible growing up. And it wasn't until I started discovering like the queer YA world that I really started to realize that romance stories were something that I couldn't just appreciate, but I could also really enjoy. And I could get a lot of joy and pleasure out of reading them. So it was a couple summers ago, like I said, that I had like a summer where all I did was just read queer YA. I want to say that was like right before I moved to Seattle. And that really changed my life because I finally found stories where I could read people like me being in relationships that looked like the various relationships that I have had over my life. Like, I'm married now, but in case you don't know, I'm bi. I've had relationships with people of various genders. I'm also non-binary, so like that's been a more recent realization, but like now it totally makes sense why I like enjoyed reading so many of these stories about relationships that subverted like the typical heterosexual narrative that a lot of us see mostly represented in media. And I was like, oh, now I understand why like these stories are resonating so much with me, a queer. So that really changed my life. But still, I had this kind of like realization that I didn't read very much romance that was like capital R romance shelved in a romance section. Another thing that made me realize that I was really missing out here is that there are so many really diverse romances out there. I wanted to read more stories that were about people that had different life experiences than me. I wanted to read more stories about people of color. I wanted to read more stories about and by authors that don't look like me. I want to read more about authors that do look like me, of course, because I really want to read more queer authors. But I realized that there is a lot of really excellent writing out there by Black women specifically in the romance genre that I did not know about. And I realized that this is a huge blind spot that I need to fix in my reading. And so I kind of was dipping my toes into it a bit here and there. I signed up for a couple of romance newsletters online, like the Book Riot Romance newsletter, and every so often I would get one of their like 99-cent Kindle deals if the story looked interesting. That's how I actually was introduced to Alyssa Cole, who apparently everyone who reads romance knows who she is, but I like just found out about her because she has a series that's about like royals, and there's a novella that is like a romance between two women, and so I read that, and then I realized there's a whole series. I also discovered The Kiss Quotient, which is a book that I probably won't ever stop talking about until the day I die, because it was the first romance and like first story really where I got to read a story about a protagonist who is autistic on the page like myself. And it just resonated with me so deeply because that was something that I had never seen before in romance. I had never seen somebody that approached relationships in such a similar way to me and, you know, wanted to navigate and negotiate dating with all of the interesting, like, sensory issues and the unique ways of communicating that, like, us autistic folk have. So that was amazing. And I wanted more of that. And so when I walked past the bookstore and I just saw this, like, chalkboard sign that said, we're going to be having a romance book club, show up at this day and this time, I felt like I had to do that. And so I did. I went to my first meeting of this romance book club. Fortunately for me, they were reading this very popular book. You may have heard of it. It's called Well Met by Jen DeLuca. It was a book of the month book, which is how come I heard about it, because I had decided to sign up for book of the month again. And it takes place at a Renaissance fair. And I was like, you know what? I'm trying to read more romance. I really didn't want to read the super, like, gory mystery thriller books that were the other selections for book of the month. I was like, I'll just give this a try, see how it is. So as luck would have it, I actually got this a little bit early because it was an early release for Book of the Month. I read it, really, really enjoyed it. It was very sweet and soft. I loved the romance between the two characters, but I also loved the importance on the characters like coming to understand that they need to take care of themselves as individuals in order to be like the best people they can be, and in order to have healthy relationships with good communication, they need to first like be able to respect themselves and be honest with themselves and not try to necessarily put on a brave face when people are trying to help, because sometimes it is very important to let people in and trust them, and that's how you're able to have healthy relationships. Not just romantic relationships either, like family relationships, community relationships are all very important in this book. Something that I learned from joining this romance book club was that it is apparently very common for romance book clubs to, or not book clubs, but just romance books to have all these like sequels and spin-offs with the side characters. And it was like the greatest surprise ever, because apparently in the normal like retailer version of Well Met, there's a little excerpt from an upcoming sequel that's called Well Played that I didn't know about because that's not included in the Book of the Month version. And the second I was like, oh, there's a sequel, everyone just sort of started laughing, which was great. I really enjoyed getting to meet other women who are readers and who care passionately about the things that I care about. Like, this is one of those things where, like, again, I feel like in previous years I had begun to unlearn the idea that, like, you can love something and be passionate about it and still think about it critically. I had this idea that, like, you couldn't do both of those at the same time. Can't imagine where in the patriarchy I could have gotten that from. But it was totally, like, refreshing to be around people that were discussing something so passionately and so intelligently at the same time. It reminded me of what I loved so much about my English courses and my classics courses in college, because those classrooms were populated with smart, intelligent women discussing things on a very deep intellectual level, but also with the most passion ever. But this is a book that we all got to read for fun. And again, it might sound kind of silly because, of course, like, I'm on BookTube and I read books for fun, but I spent so much time reading books that were not for my own, you know, enjoyment throughout all of school that, like, yes, I learned things, but I love getting to hear people talk about these things like we're in a class, but we're all choosing to be there and enjoy this and read for fun. The other thing that I really enjoyed and didn't expect, honestly, was the sense of community that was going to come from joining a book club. I've always wanted to be part of a book club, but I never have been. Any attempts that I've really had to, like, try and get one off the ground myself have kind of fizzled out after a little while. I've had a lot more success with, like, discussing books with people online, which is great. But this is something that, like, I really wanted to see what that, like, classic book club experience was going to be like. And I was not prepared for how welcoming these women all were to me. Some of them had just recently gone to a romance event that happened here locally, and they brought back, like, a bunch of different free books in a bag that they had gotten, and they were all too willing to let me have free books, like me, a stranger that they had just met. They were like, would you like to borrow these books? They were all too willing to give me recommendations, ask me about what the books I had already read in the romance genre were, and, like, why I had decided to start reading romance now and stuff like that. And that just, like, truly was incredible. Like, it's one of the things that I love most about book people, and when we're all together, is, like, how friendly people are. But I was just blown away by, like, the total generosity that these women showed me as somebody that came being like, hey, I really want to read more romance, but I don't really know where to begin, so I decided a book club was going to be a good idea. So that was my experience of the book club. I think that, like, as this, I guess it's going to be a series now. It's going to be a series. As this series goes on, I think I'm going to make more videos about each of the book club sessions we do. I know we're not meeting in December because holidays and travel and everything are making scheduling difficult for people, so we're going to be meeting again in January 2020, and we're going to be reading a book called The Bromance Book Club, which I know has a male protagonist, and he has decided to read romance novels to learn how to better his relationship with his girlfriend. And he gets a bunch of like other people at his work. He is a baseball player, so he gets a bunch of his teammates to join this like bromance book club as well, so that they can all read romance books in order to have better relationships. I'm not gonna say that like that speaks to me personally, but it really does, as someone that's really new to romance. So I'm excited for that. I will probably try and like make some sort of video. I have an idea for something I want to do like romance-wise in December, now that I feel like I'm beginning to crack open this whole new world. Like, it's exciting. There are new authors to discover. There are new tropes to learn. There are like there's amazing cover art in romance novels that goes above and beyond the stuff that I remember from when I was a kid, like the bodice rippers or like the guys with the Fabio hair and the abs and everything. Like, that still exists in romance, but like, come on, this is the sort of like tired millennial aesthetic that helps refresh me when I am fatigued, is this cover, these pastels and cute little flower crowns and stuff like that. So that's gonna be a thing that I'm doing now. I don't know what I'm gonna call it yet. I might call it a year of reading romantically. Hopefully it's many years of reading romantically. But yeah, that's gonna do it. So if you would like to follow me along on this journey or listen to me talk about other books that I loved, hated, or felt just meh about, please give my channel a subscribe if you haven't done so already. As always, thank you so very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.